Welcome everybody to this online edition of Document Film Festival. It's lovely to see so many familiar faces and unfamiliar faces. And yeah, huge pleasure to welcome you to this event with the wonderful Baier, where we'll be touching on many things around archives, memory, erasure, queer cinema, and of course the legacy of the great Barbara Hammer, whose Nitrate Kisses serves as kind of an inspiration for So's anarchival book, A Nazi Word for a Nazi Thing, and also something of a kind of anchor for our film program this year, where we explore how some of the silences and absences are produced and reproduced, particularly at moments of emergency and crisis, and in turn, I guess, how filmmakers can kind of occupy some of these spaces. So for those of you who don't know, So is a writer, a film programmer, and film critic. They are the author of Juxtaposition, Political Animals, the New Feminist Cinema, and have contributed writing to, amongst other things, Not That Bad, Dispatches from Rape Culture, and the Introduction to Spells, 21st Century Occult Poetry. So is also a bookseller at Burley Fisher Books in London, a curator with queer feminist film collective Club des Femmes, and co-founder of Raising Films, a campaign and community for parents and carers in the film industry. And we're delighted that after So's presentation, we'll also be joined by Camilla Baier and Rachel Pronger of Invisible Women, which is an archive activist film collective which champions the work of female filmmakers from the history of cinema. Founded in 2017, Camilla and Rachel have presented titles sourced from collections around the world at cinemas, festivals, galleries across the UK. And alongside curated screenings, they publish their own original writing and criticism as well. So without any further ado, I'll pass over to the wonderful Baier.
Thank you so much, Sam. And I want to say a special thanks to Sam for the discussions that led up to me being able to write this talk and be involved in the festival. And thanks to everyone at Document, especially Alex and Marta this evening. And I also want to say thanks to Rachel and Camille for joining this event. That's going to be the important bit, the Q&A, where I get to hear from hopefully several of you, as many of you as possible. So I'm going to talk fast and we'll get to the questions as soon as we can. I want to thank Document for taking on screening the explosive work that is Barbara Hammer's Nitrate Kisses, and also extend huge thanks to Electronic Art Intermix in New York, who take such great care of Barbara's work and legacy, and especially to Carl McCall and Michael Blair, who made it possible for the festival to screen the film, even though they were both on furlough. Thanks are also due to Mark Toscano of the Academy Film Archive. If you've watched the film via Document, what you'll have seen is a digitization of the new print of Nitrate Kisses, which he made for the Academy. Nitrate Kisses was Barbara Hammer's first feature-length film, and it premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in 1993. Time has ceased to have any meaning. This is how the catalogue described it. In 1990, while researching at the George Eastman Archive in Rochester, New York, Hammer discovered what may have been one of the earliest gay films, Lot in Sodom. Utilizing outtakes and clips interwoven with an assortment of other materials, including footage from German narrative feature films of the 30s, interviews, period music, and shots of 3 separate couples making love, she offers a different set of images about lesbian and gay life than those which have previously emerged. In doing so, she challenges not only the dominant ideology of the heterosexual society, but confronts powerfully and graphically our images of sexual and erotic love. This is not a liberal film, the catalogue continues, attempting to assimilate its eroticism into a safe and accepted world. It is in fact subversive and adamant in its efforts to force us to see what we've managed to avoid for so many years. Hammer is not, however, just an ideologue. Her artistry is striking. Just going to move my notes. Sometimes formal, but more often associative and constructive. Nitrate Kisses is a representation which operates on many levels, including allegorical, historical, and erotic. The filmmaker also sees it as an invitation to elicit personal history. It is without question a statement about sexual mores which will remain impressed on all who view it. What's striking about this from 20 years distance, 30 years distance, time, in terms of the film's later reception, and for those of us who watched or rewatched it this week with an awareness of Holocaust Remembrance Day, is that the note makes no mention of why Hammer was drawing on German films of the 1930s to recontextualize lesbian and gay culture. It makes no mention of why she was reconstructing Weimar queer culture as part of her argument about persistent and pervasive American homophobic censorship, or about why the film collages multiple forgotten or previously unattended to archival sources to do a specific kind of memory work. And it's that memory work that I want to try and elucidate this evening. I'm hoping that some or many of you have already availed yourselves of this opportunity to watch Nitrate Kisses, and that some or many of you will re-avail yourself of the chance to rewatch it or to watch it while it's still on the document player for the rest of this weekend. I think it was last screened in the UK at Tate Modern's retrospective of Hammer's work in 2012. Hammer had just been to Gaza with a queer BDS tour facilitated by filmmaker John Grayson before she came to London. And she told us in the audience that while she was very excited to be sharing her oeuvre with us, what she was really excited about was crossing the iced over Millennium Bridge to share and discuss her raw footage in Tent City University at Occupy London. Which is to say two things at least. First of all, that I wish Barbara was still here with us so that she could speak to you about her anarchic, erotic work finding lives in the archives and her rage for the plural and partial, as opposed to impartial, histories. My account of the film tonight is a partial history in that sense. This is a film I love deeply, but it's also partial because Nitrate Kisses exists in a continuum of Hammer's half-century of work and the work of those that she was connected to and in conversation with. The film itself is also a continuum that locates its guiding theme, the erasure of queer sexuality, erotics, and desire, not in a single site, but as a pattern cast across the 20th century, one deeply, intrinsically connected to racism, anti-Semitism, fascism's class oppression, and misogyny. It's a pattern that she locates doubly, in the violent erasures present in official archives, and in the living continuum of film outtakes, blues lyrics, and oral histories that speak not just of or for, but with and through the bodies that carry them into the film. Barbara Hammer's final audiovisual work, finished in 2019, was called Evidentiary Bodies, and it was made as a pair with a 2018 performance lecture that she called, all in caps, The Art of Dying, or in brackets, palliative art making in the age of anxiety. And I want to take these last titles, phrases, ideas that Hammer gifted us and situate what I'm saying tonight between these two concepts of evidentiary bodies and the art of dying or palliative art making in the age of anxiety. Of course, Nitrate Kisses itself could equally have been called evidentiary bodies. The title sums up exactly how she worked with her own and others' bodies across her career. Evidence of what, we can ask. The first answer that comes to mind is of lives that are otherwise unseen, and deaths which, because of that, have not been fully grieved, because they have been denied the full complexity and texture of the lives that were lived. Although it's not the word that my book, a Nazi word for a Nazi thing, and I'm obliged by my publisher to hold it up at this moment. Although this is not the word that my book is concerned with, this operation of power of denying life by denying death is emblematized by a particular Nazi word usage, one which means precisely thing, ein Stück, item, piece, object, a word that was used in official reports to refer to and describe the people who were sent to concentration camps. Hammer's body of work is evidentiary specifically of LGBTIQ+ life, but of what happens when you attend to lives that have been named ein Stück and place them back into their context and lived experience. Her work looks particularly, but not exclusively, at lesbian life as doubly hidden because of being women's history and queer history, and she's particularly attentive to working class history as well. She looks at lives and ways of living that are obscured and erased when not even being outright destroyed. And I'm going to substitute that acronym LGBTIQ+ with a better one coined by lesbian couple Nicola Griffiths and Kelly Eskridge to help us do some of this work. This is an acronym I am trying to make happen, so please help me. And the acronym is quilt bag. And the second answer to that question of evidence of what, which has a complex relationship with that first answer of quilt bag life, and is what I want to talk about this evening, is quilt bag death. This is the idea that quilt bag life is intractably and only documentable as and because of quilt bag death. And that tends to be something that appears in mainstream documentaries or mainstream histories that only tell after the fact and make quilt bag identity appear that as something that is deathly, that is already pre-condemned, that can only be spoken about in prior and past terms. And that is always part of what Hammer's films are challenging. And this is the difficult thing, they are always a valediction refiguring mourning. Nitrate Kisses demands a new kind of public space for active mourning, one in which death does not objectify, sentimentalize, sanitize, or monumentalize quilt bag people in particular, but not only. In Euro-Western culture, one of the classical terms given for what cultural works of mourning can do is catharsis, a word that derives ultimately from katharos, meaning at root to purify or to purge. While it's usually taken to mean the powerful emotional effect that art can have, the penumbra of purity and purging suggests the sanitizing ways in which the state can performatively obscure and erase the granular, asymmetrical realities of experiences that occur during a catastrophe or a loss. The catharsis of public mourning can be used by the state, by power, to accrue prestige, allowing politicians and other agents of death to absolve themselves. In the late 1980s, Hammer had become involved in AIDS activism in New York by the human rights advocate Florrie Burke, her then new lover, who became her life partner. Prior to making Nitrate Kisses, she'd made AIDS activist films, including No No Nookie, a critique of abstinence only and abstinence first education and media, and Nitrate Kisses, of course, could be called No No Nookie. It's infused also with the radical forms of mourning that AIDS activists were generating, not only against the state, but against their played out forms of exclusionary and erasive catharsis. Queer theorist and activist Douglas Crimp coined the perfect description for what he saw happening around him, one that describes Nitrate Kisses as well. Militant melancholia, an activism that refused the closure that one is expected to achieve in mourning, setting both the life and death behind one, a form that would cast the dead aside as erased. Instead, what Crimp saw around him were protests that confronted society with its own refusal to bear witness to an epidemic whose effect had been perpetuated by political malevolence. Crimp was describing not only die-ins, which we might think of as one of the most prominent and pervasive forms of AIDS activism, but also vivid kinds of street theatre, direct actions against big pharma CEOs and politicians, eruptive interventions into cathedrals, and the kind of candid sexual health PSAs broadcast on cable that Frances Negron-Montagnier and others have detailed. These were protests that were burning full of liveliness and sexiness as itself a protest, but they never lost sight of the avoidable criminal deaths and sickness occurring all around them. And beyond that, they drew attention to the erasure of those deaths and sicknesses through the devaluation of those who got sick and died. This erasure occurred in multiple ways. There was willed scientific ignorance and willed political negligence that led to the misrepresentation, the euphemisms, the blurrings of statistics on cause of death. And there was the erasure of quilt bag life and desire when it came to caring for and mourning those who died. But what does all this have to do with documentary? In an interview with feminist film scholar Gwendolyn Audrey Foster, Hammer said, quote, I have always read that a biographer needs to look at the context of an individual's life. But looking back on mine, it seems even more profound. He or she is there only as part of a long tradition that includes ancestry, tribal rights, and histories, and so on. Foster notes that Hammer was in the business of renewing communal rituals. And into the space of ritual renewal, Hammer brings two practices that throughout her career are completely interconnected: experimental filmmaking and sex. Dyke Tactics, often referred to as Hammer's first film, although perhaps better to say her first well-known film, made in 1974, is a 4-minute long film and the first surviving film known to be by a lesbian filmmaker depicting explicit lesbian sex. It's often categorized as experimental, and it's also documentary. Hammer herself appears as one of the women having sex. Writing about the film in her autobiography, Hammer, exclamation mark, making movies out of sex and life, Hammer notes that its idyllic, sexy, utopian vision of a lesbian collective at work and sex play in a sunlit Californian meadow is also an acknowledgement of an absence in the archives. It's an act of radical ritual anti-catharsis for the lack of non-medicalized, non-pornographized, self-actualized depictions of lesbian sexuality. We discovered who we were, writes Hammer, as we stepped into the void, the invisible, the blank screen, and named ourselves lesbian. As Nitrate Kisses shows, if you are excluded by dominance culture, the archive itself is the void. Archives, as manifestations of state power, may be used deliberately to erase certain communities, individuals, political formations, and histories, not only by excluding or obfuscating details about them, but also by collecting and appropriating all the available information and its interpretation in order to criminalize, divide, disperse, and erase. The archive itself may become a form of erasure, acting in concert with the other buildings that the state erects to contain and control people that it wants to die unseen. And it's important to remember that the archive, before it was an immaterial abstract concept in theory, was a building. It literally means the house of the ruler, the house of the archon, the physical building where records were kept in a pre-digital age. Alongside the forensic architecture of concentration camps, detention centers, residential schools, plantations, prisons, and care homes, we can include the archive. And also note that additionally, all of those punitive architectures depend upon, produce, and lose endless documentation as cover for their activities. Archives are not just implicit in punitive architectures, but actively complicit. And I'm thinking today, particularly of the University of Harvard's announcement about their museums, decolonizing announcement that included the phrase that they possess, quote, the remains of more than 22,000 individuals, a continuing act of racist colonial genocide, of a refusal to see, as Judith Butler puts it, which lives are grievable. One way in which lives are rendered not grievable is by their deaths being hidden and obfuscated, as we are witnessing now in this country on a mass scale. People physically removed from their communities and transmuted into statistics and denied any form of mourning other than power's appropriation. What then can a documentary do? There has to be more than the liberal pursuit of the human interest story, of putting a single individual face on mass grief, of telling a single exceptionalized and often sentimentalized story. This is where, for me, the profound power of the concept evidentiary bodies might meet what Hammer learned and shared in The Art of Dying, palliative art making in the age of anxiety. If performative mourning can be instituted by the state as a kind of sanitization, a purging by which power erases its own culpability, and often erases any counter documentation or grassroots documentation as well, then what can experimental documentary do to take the place of the eulogy and the elegy? If archives erase by absorbing and abstracting, can time-based audiovisual media like Nitrate Kisses offer a form of memory work that recovers, revivifies, and respects, but without making the promise of reconciliation, recompense, and full restoration. What would it mean, is part of what I'm asking, to think about some of this year's documentaries as, among other things, a new practice of public militant melancholia that hold a space for recovery and revivification without claiming complete restoration. To think of them as films that think through and about models of liveliness as protest, not against death, but that include and recognize death, that move toward placing those who have died, those who are ill, as evidentiary bodies who demand and command respect. And what then happens when these evidentiary bodies meet the archive? This was the question that Hammer pursued in Nitrate Kisses and beyond in the great biographical documentaries of her late career. And I'm thinking in particular of Lover Other, about the invisibilized queer artist Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore, and this, I think it's This House Is Mine, but someone please correct me, her film about the poet Elizabeth Bishop. She also made a film about herself, A Horse Is Not a Metaphor, which documented her own lived experience of and after breast cancer, and like No No Nookie, broke down some of the dominant medicalized metaphors, particularly around the idea of a struggle or fight or battle with cancer. Speaking to Elisabeth Liebovici about her research on Cahun and Moore in the Jersey archives, on the island where the couple lived most of their lives, and where they were also imprisoned and sentenced to death, in fact, for resisting the Nazi invasion, Hammer notes, in the Cahun-Moore archive, I found a love letter cut with jagged edge scissors, so only one sentence remained. Again and again, as with the Willa Cather archive at the beginning of Nitrate Kisses, Hammer shows us both the archive joy of finding that remaining sentence and the grief of the cut of the jagged edge scissors. She fills the serrated spaces without smoothing out their serration. If the film is, as Sundance said, quote, in fact, subversive and adamant in its efforts to force us to see what we've managed to avoid for so many years, then part of what it's asking us to see is not just living queer sexuality itself, but the ways in which it exceeds the frame, the ways in which it comes up against the jagged edge that heteronormativity makes around it, the ways in which film, because of its history, cannot handle these kisses. Nitrate Kisses is not primarily a sex education film, although it is both sexy and educational, which is unlike most sex education films, or a scientific documentary, modes of filmmaking that constitute a considerable percentage of the cinematic archive of sex, and which could be called all evidence and no bodies. It's also not part of that larger share of the archive, pornography, in which bodies are situated as bodies and not evidentiary. But it does draw in a very self-aware manner on both modes. It draws them together and questions the line demarcating them, then asks why the cinematic sexual archive is almost entirely confined to these two modes that both differently and to different extents render individual and living bodies as object lessons. I think this is part of what Hammer means by saying that not that the body is evidence, but evidentiary, adjectival, a description of one aspect of the body's granular liveliness and liveness, its ability to account for itself. Bodies do a lot of things, often all at once. They are erotic and ill and intellectual and practical. They carry familial, cultural, and personal history. They are latent with memory and possibility. And they are in touch with other bodies at levels from bacterial to neurological. One way to say this is Nitrate Kisses is a film that structurally and thematically works like a body. It doesn't show bodies as evidence. It participates formally in the ways that bodies are evidentiary, how they show the fullness of themselves. So what if we say that our flesh, in its complex integrity and intermeshing, all of it, messy, sexy, ill, and intractable, is the archive, is memory, is ritual. Our flesh that is at once individual and yet is our connective tissue, that is spectacularized and hypersexualized in mainstream audiovisual culture, yet remains radical and resistant and irreducible in its lived specificity. Nitrate Kisses draws attention to the basis of censorship and fascisms in eugenics, in resisting specifically the irreducibility of this lived specificity and how it connects us, how it rejects the messy, lived, plural, erotic, connective body, not just as itself, but as evidentiary, a source of thought, politics, work, desire, and pride. I've talked a lot about the film, so perhaps it's time to share some of it with you so that for those of you who haven't seen it, you can see some of what I'm trying to say. And for those of you who have seen it, perhaps this is a different context. This is a section where the film is particularly working against the jagged-edged space cut by the scissors in the archive itself. Here's an interview with, I think, the writer Sander Zeig, although the interviewees are not listed by name in the film. It's intercut with a recording of Lotte Lenya singing Brecht and Weil's Alabama song, and with one of the 4 sex scenes that Hammer shot for the film. I'm going to share my screen, so wish me luck.
If we go back to Unter den Linden in that street, and the women putting their description of themselves on a piece of paper on the wall.
And they made something, signs, for example, you have to wear a rose in your, on your jacket when you come. But it's oral history. I don't know the details. It was told by an old writer, a lesbian writer, I know her. And she was young in this time, but she had an older lover. So it's the second oral generation to know about it. We have not very much details. I don't have these details. Some women here in West Berlin try to get this history, but it's very hard to find something out, because the Nazi time was a very, very hard time for the lesbians, and because after the war, the lesbian and gay people were like the people we called Sinti and Roma, gypsies, yes. We had the same problems like the gypsies or the lesbian and gays who were in KZ, for example. We had to hide our history and to work with the hurting inside. The lesbian and gay people here in Germany and the gypsies, they don't have anybody who listens to their story. When they
This is one of the many parts of the documentary that is reflexive about storytelling itself and about the ways in which stories are told. And this is one of the aspects of the book, the film that I write about in A Nazi Word for a Nazi Thing. And this is the first time I've ever quoted myself in a talk, so it's quite exciting. And I'm also very embarrassed. I mainly want to do it as an opportunity to thank Peninsula Press, who published the book, and editors Sam Fisher, Jake Franklin, and Will Rees, who made it infinitely better, including helping me clarify this particular section, which became an important thread that ramifies throughout the final text. So this is from the book. The final sections of Nitrate Kisses turn to erasing the erasure of lesbians within the history of Nazi persecution, drawing on police records, archival fragments, and oral history, which Hammer supplements with a contemporary lesbian BDSM scene. When one voiceover speaker mentions oral history, there is a swift, funny, and knowing cut to oral sex between the couple. One intervention into the erasive state archive is to make the lived body, especially the body classed as deviant because it is sexual and because it is not cis male, palpable. Diana Taylor calls this the repertoire, forms of eruptive, excessive, often oral, performance and embodied memory that cannot be captured by the records. Taylor argues that the body is both itself a record and a technology of transmission, which can be wielded by those excluded by colonialism and heteropatriarchy because it is devalued and made invisible. When dance, music, theatricality, protest installations, consciously staged narratives or images, dream sequences, and of course, sex erupt in documentary, they can supercharge how we pay attention. These acts that center the body as a self-aware site of making identity and community remind us at once that each of us is not only psychologically, but also cellularly an archive, or rather, an anarchive, an uncontainable mesh of ever-changing repertoire and stored, organized information. What matters about what we are watching is this: the facts of the body are both irreducible and entirely shaped by our witnessing. This is what AIDS activist and carer Rebecca Brown called the gifts of the body. Its intervulnerability that brings together, that shows us that the processes of living and dying are factual, material, indelible, and also require being seen and being understood in order for their materiality to matter. When documentary breaks out into repertoire as an ethical strategy, it has the opposite effect to the one that Laura Mulvey describes of the close-up of the female star or the musical number in Hollywood studio cinema. Rather than stopping the action, it calls us to reevaluate the action, our addiction to linear plot and narrative and resolution. It redefines the relationship between film and viewer as intervulnerable. We are asked to do the work of interpretation. We become aware of our own evidentiary bodies as the site of that work, and of their responsibility for the evidentiary bodies we are seeing or hearing, or not quite seeing or hearing. We look and listen again. Repertoire in documentary calls us to look again, which is the literal meaning of respect, re speakere, to look again. Ethical strategies can center evidentiary bodies, ethical repertoire strategies can center evidentiary bodies in and as themselves. These might include forms of reframing such as subjective narration and re-narration, revealing the construction of the film and its sources, intercutting between modes, found footage and sex, oral history and music, repetition, optical printing, which Hammer used extensively in her 16mm works, and an open narrative structure or strategy that does not insist on completion, closure, or containment, so that the end of the film asks us to look again, to look for more, to make our own works, to continue the work because it is not finished. Archive documentary, especially with regards to human rights, often seeks this kind of completion and closure, a containment that feels necessary because the crimes against humanity are so great. It is often spoken about in terms such as recuperative or reparative, and those terms are important analogical ones that speak to living audiences in our needs. But the truth is that the gaps in the archive, both missing or destroyed or non-existent documents, and the lives that they attempt to erase, cannot be repaired or recuperated in full. Eradicated histories, whether personal or political, and they are of course always both in nature, but I mean in scale or focus, can be shaded in, approached from multiple angles, reimagined, re-engaged, spliced, sought, encountered, refreshed, and hoped for. In this moment, though, as we watch the English government, among others globally, in the very process of the eugenicist erasure of those who have died and those who are ill, what I want to ask is, how do we hold a place for that other gap, the one between what can be recuperated and repaired, as it should be, as it had to be, and what cannot? Without despair or dismissal, without asserting totalized destruction, how do we look again? How do we respect that which has been lost, that which is gone? How do we use the tools and strategies of the documentary, the essay film, the anarchival poem, all the approaches seen in Nitrate Kisses and across document to recuperate and repair, and through that, to respect, to bear witness to what is not? I want, in Hammer's term, to call, or rather call attention to this kind of filmmaking, or an aspect of it, as palliative care. And I want to thank my friend, the film scholar and writer Jenny Chamarette, for reminding me of the dual nature of the word palliare, to cloak. In its original usage, palliative meant treatment for the symptoms, but not the cause, thus cloaking the etiology of the disease. The compound palliative care has come to mean care for the terminally ill and their families. Palliative care, rather than palliative treatment, is care that recognizes death and respects life. It does not erase or pretend away death, but considers the living body in its hands and what the person who is dying needs and wants. Like the word screen referring to a fabric that can conceal from view, or, as in cinema screen, offer something up to view, cloak, pallium, mean the sheet of fabric that can conceal or hide, but also one that can safeguard and comfort the body in and against all weathers, to shield, to protect what is vulnerable and subject to erasure. Palliative care is tender. Hammer's film subsequent to Nitrate Kisses, an autobiographical film, was called Tender Fictions. It specifically involves and requires intimacy, intimate touch, intimate knowledge, and also intimate consent. Palliative care recognizes that it is working in a community, one in which one person or some people are dying, and others will, for some time anyway, go on living after that death or deaths. It holds these two things together centrally for both the dying and the living. It holds together the need for recuperation and the fact of loss. Patient-led and patient advocate-led palliative care was one significant part of the militant melancholia and communal ritual of AIDS activism. It fits with marching in the streets, making art, holding meetings, holding hands, and occupying buildings. It was, in a sense, an occupation, particularly as hospitals previously excluded families and lovers of AIDS patients. It was, in a sense, a protest, a meeting and a making taking place at a bedside. It was a refusal to cloak, to hide away, or to be hidden. It also changed medical care protocols, and it makes me wonder how its ideas and practices might change how we approach the very real bodies that are both contained and erased by archives, the lives that our work could care for. It's very important to note that palliative care is largely the domain of nurses and care workers, whose work is seen as non-expert. It's hugely undervalued and underpaid, precisely because of its engagement with tenderness, intimacy, and consent, precisely because it does not claim to cure definitively, nor does it abrogate patients and their families' right to grieve into a message of institutional power. The majority of care workers, certainly in the UK, are women, and particularly women of colour, immigrant women, working class women, and older women. I do not want to imply abstractly that filmmakers' work is palliative care when it is not doing this real hard work. I want to argue that we as filmmakers, scholars, curators, and viewers can learn, as Hammer did during her multiple treatments for cancer, from and with care workers' labour, from their ingenuity and an integrity in respecting the intractable fact of death while providing the best possible care, attention, treatment to and towards livingness. There is a need to attend to care work as a cogent and urgent theory and practice of how to work with evidentiary bodies, how to be present to them, how to narrate them, how to not erase them. And there is a concomitant need to extend to filmmaking as work, and for whom it is work, whose bodies labour invisibly. And I think of the exoticized extras in Lot of Sodom, and the Black Hollywood actors of the studio era who were all too often uncredited for their roles, when indeed they were given them. When we think about filmmaking and archival research and scholarship as work, bodies, the most vulnerable bodies, the least seen bodies, are uncloaked, the bodies that do the most care. And I just want to offer a sort of quick reminder that when Hammer made Nitrate Kisses, doing archival work was extremely physical labor. There was no digitized material. Everything had to be found by hand, viewed on an editing desk, cut, reprinted as needed. And that meant, you know, not just traveling to Rochester, but traveling around the country, asking favors and putting it all together on a very small budget. And it's also important to acknowledge that this film was funded by Frameline, and the importance of Quilt Bag and other community-based film festivals, without which much of this archival material would never have been re-accessed and reinterpreted. Nitrate Kisses attends towards livingness in the ethics of its memory work, which includes both its rage and its joy, and its foregrounding of the connection between them. It takes palliative care of its evidentiary bodies, especially where both evidence and bodies have been deliberately destroyed, and then that destruction itself covered over. Nitrate, too, is a material with a double quality, like a cloak or a screen. Nitrocellulose was first known as gun cotton because before being used in the first film cameras, that was what it was used for, to light the fuses of guns. How could such a highly flammable material ever have been called upon to document the world around us? Battlefield doctors during the American Civil War noted that the combustible liquid had another property, a stickiness that meant when painted on a surface, it formed sheets. They used it as a wound dressing, palliative treatment on those battlefields. Both explosive and adhesive, destructive and healing, nitrate film has infused the post-nitrate moving image with these dual and entwined qualities in how we might present and erase evidentiary bodies with care. Thank you.
Thank you, So. That was just brilliant. I feel a bit speechless now. So just to kick off this next section, we're going to have a little Q&A, but really we want everyone to be able to ask questions, and we want it to be as laid back and as open as possible. So Camilla and myself are going to ask a couple of warm-up questions, but please, if you've got a question that you'd like to ask So, then please just put it in the chat box. We can either read out your question from the chat box, or if you'd like to say it yourself, if you'd like to come on mic and speak to us directly, then that's great too. Just mention in your question that that's what you'd like to do, and we'll try and make that happen. And we're going to talk now for about 20 to 30 minutes. So it's Friday night, not going to keep you too long, but we also know that there was loads there that we're going to want to dig into. And comments are welcome too. Put them in the box. That would be great.
Yeah. And anyone who doesn't want to necessarily have, you can also send us the question to either Rachel or I, and then we can read it out for you. That's perfectly fine as well.
Lots of options, lots of options. And lots of nice comments coming in already saying how moving that was, and I think that's true, definitely. And it's quite hard to jump in after you've just been so articulate with a question. But just to get started, I wanted to ask a little bit about your relationship to Barbara Hammer, who you speak about so warmly and affectionately in that presentation, and specifically your relationship with Nitrate Kisses. So you mention in the book, which is right here, you mentioned a little bit about your context of encountering Nitrate Kisses, and I think that's a really interesting story because it's a story about gaps and erasure in a very explicit way. And I was just wondering, for the people that haven't read the book and just generally, if you could talk a little bit about when you watched Nitrate Kisses and how you watched it.
So I saw Nitrate Kisses when I was in graduate school, which is a very neutral statement. What I mean is that the institution that I studied at, which was in Canada, had an educational licensed video. And the way that you watched these videos was in the library. There were sort of hooded monitors that you sat at with headphones on, and anyone who was walking past could see what you were watching. And I hadn't really read that much about Nitrate Kisses before I saw it. I was sort of working my way through a syllabus of films. I just watched Trinity Menhar's Reassemblage, and so I thought, great, the next video that's available is Nitrate Kisses. And watching it in essentially a public space where any passing person who was curious could watch me watching it was quite an intense experience. I mean, both Reassemblage and Nitrate Kisses are such intense films, and the sort of cine-rhetorical moves they make are so powerful that by the end of that session, my head was just exploding. And in some ways it was really that class and those encounters that made me want to, I don't know, be a feminist film professional. That's not a thing, but we can say it's a thing to be an activist and a critic, and to continue that work, because they both, in some ways, watching them in that public space felt so right, because they're both these very open works about what is a library, what is an archive, what is memory, how do we access it, how do we argue with it, who has the right to watch what where. And so that was my first encounter, and then I saw the film again in the Tate Modern retrospective with an audience and with Barbara Hammer in attendance, and that was just, you know, moving on another scale, and hearing her answer questions about that film and how it had shaped her practice. It was the first archival film that feature-length film that she'd made, although she'd already been working with the archives in Rochester with James Sibley Watson's material, who directed Lot of Sodom, but he also made a series of films that really, really raised this question of the bodies that work in cinema, because he gave people barrier meals and then x-rayed them, undertaking daily tasks of highly gendered natures, like putting on lipstick or putting on stockings or shaving. And there's no record of what the effect of that radioactive material was for those people. He wasn't a doctor. These were just artistic investigations. So these very ethically ambivalent films, which she reframed, she optically printed into an incredible film called Sanctus, which does exactly this work of militant melancholia, is a memorial, an anti-cathartic memorial for these people who really did the work in these films. So I, you know, had the honor of meeting Barbara at the Tate and stepping in at very short notice to take over an event that she was doing, because the writer Anne Svetkovich was unwell and unable to come, which is one of the most daunting things I've ever done. And Barbara was incredibly generous and kind, and then kissed me on stage, on the cheek, in the middle of something I was saying. Everyone who worked with her describes this kind of impish presence that always kept you off balance, kept you questioning, that was so fully embodied. And just her excitement about Occupy, her curiosity about it, about leaving the institution, leaving the Tate as soon as she possibly could, and going to talk to the people in the tents. And I don't know if those who remember that winter, it was icy, it was absolutely freezing for London, and she just wanted to be out there, and then she wanted to be filming herself talking to the young people that she met at Occupy about the young people that she'd been talking to in Gaza, so she could send that footage to Gaza so that she could connect them. And that was what she was like. That's what she's left us with, you know. Her filmmaking goes on through the Barbara Hammer experimental lesbian filmmaking grants. There are 5 projects being done by younger filmmakers. I think there's still 3 to be completed, with work from her archive, her anarchive, that was messy and alive, and she opened it up. There's nothing institutional about it. So that is an incredible gesture to say, these are the works that I always wanted to do more with, and come in, here you are, next generation, let's have some amazing conversations about race in the US. Let's talk about trans rights, let's talk about non-binary identity, through working together on these films when she was at that point too ill to work physically on them herself.
Yeah, that goes back to what you were talking about earlier as well, about reflexive storytelling and collective storytelling, I think, in that sense as well, which is what she does in Nitrate Kisses as well, right? By bringing other people into the boat to give their oral testimony, right?
No one's ever going to be able to say that again without smiling with pleasure, and I think that's amazing.
You have to say with a smile and a wink. But it's this storytelling, which something that Rachel and I were talking about as well, and that we feel that both Nitrate Kisses and you as well, in a Nazi word, go back to a lot, which are the silences, and how both these works, so your book and the film, are attempts to capture a history that acknowledges these silences. And so the film opens with this really poignant quote by Adrienne Rich, but she also said something that stuck with me a lot, which is that lying is done with words, but also with silence. And you also open one of the chapters by saying silence is self-replicating. So maybe you could unpack a little bit more these concepts of silences in histories and how what effect they have in reconditioning our histories and the histories that we see in the archives.
Sure. I mean, it's such a huge question that we're seeing, you know, play out actually in real time at the moment, to do with, you know, news reporting and the way in which the concept of, you know, I can't put enough quotation marks around it, but free speech and cancel culture are actually being weaponized to create silences, to stop reportage, to silence reporters from asking legitimate questions, to take down, you know, evidenced writing. So we're sort of having this moment where we're seeing the silences of the archive produced in real time, including of, you know, national and international news media being very supine when it comes to reporting what power is doing and how it's conducting itself, and having to know where to access these other kinds of reporting, and how to evaluate them and how to, you know, share them. So I think, you know, and it's maybe in the same way that when we talk about visibility, there's two kinds of visibility. There's self-actualized visibility, going back to that word that I used for how Hammer was thinking about dyke tactics as sort of self-actualized lesbian visibility. And then there's enforced or hyper-visibility, where people are produced as visible by power. And there's kinds of silencing by power. And then also, I guess, what I was trying to find a way to reach for this evening was thinking about, I guess, what we might call a self-actualized silence, a silence of public mourning, a place where we hold a silence, or we observe a silence, or we make a silence palpable, as an act, you know, almost of what Pauline Oliveros, who was a colleague of Hammer's, they made a wonderful work together, might call deep listening. So how do we acknowledge those silences and take deep soundings of them without immediately filling them up with different kinds of chatter, or the, you know, this need for complete restoration and restitution? What might it mean to acknowledge those acts of silencing? So I think, you know, again, that like the cloak or the screen, the silence has these two aspects of, is there a way in which we can wield silence as refusal, as acknowledgement, as framing, as protest, to recognize the acts of silencing that have another effect when power wills them, and the difficulty of tracing those in the archive is partially because of what we're seeing right now, the ways in which they're produced so completely and so complicitly. Yeah.
And this goes back as well to that idea that you talk about of the archive ache, and the idea of the sort of knowledge that there has been an archive that is gone, and you can see the evidence of the archive, you can see the scorch marks, but you can't see the material, and you can't regain that. And it's definitely a frustration that Camilla and I have found with our own curatorial work. And it's like you talk about in the book about the parfait footage there is of the Institute for Sexual Sciences in Berlin, of that being burned, the research being burned, and that's an evidence of a loss. But the actual thing isn't there. It's just it's like the scorch marks, but nothing else, no material.
Yeah.
To bring it to a more cheerful idea, though, something that comes out really strongly in Nitrate Kisses, and I think I would urge anyone who hasn't had a chance to watch it yet to watch it, because it's such a joyful film, and it's a film that's full of pleasure. And I think that what Barbara Hammer does really, really well is she is telling a story that is full of tragedy and loss and anger, but she tells it in this wonderful, pleasurable, joyful way that is about life and it's about living, and that insists upon us acknowledging that these people have lived joyful lives and are living joyful lives. And it's not just a story of victimhood and loss and erasure, it's a story of triumphant living. And she's also telling a history of sexuality, which is a history of touch. And it's a very tactile film, and it's almost the opposite of standing in a dusty archive and feeling cut off from history. It's history is right in your face, it's dancing, it's shagging, it's amazing. And I just wondered if you might want to talk a little bit about the role that sensual pleasure can play in this building of an archive of queer experience.
Wow, this is, extremely one of the moments that I wish that Barbara Hammer could be here with us to talk about, in particular how she filmed those sex scenes, how she found those couples and worked with them for their consent and comfort and their sort of understanding of the place they were taking in the film and in history. And sort of rewatching it today, rewatching it this year a few times, I was really also conscious of the place of safer sex in the film, that it shows condom use, it shows the use of a dental dam and a glove, that it is educational, it's sexy educational, because those things were not being shown in mainstream media communications about safe sex and risk assessment. There were euphemisms, the condom on the banana, references, even, it's a sin. As Russell T Davies pointed out, it's still not allowed to show an erection on TV. So condom use could be shown in terms of opening a condom, but not in terms of like the technique of rolling a condom onto a penis. And that as the show also sort of indicates, partially led to some of the lack of information, the lack of knowledge, and risks of infection, because there was no shame-free sort of way of depicting this. And Nitrate Kisses, like, it's quite hard to overstate, in 1993 at Sundance, just how many like barriers this was breaking through and transgressing, both Rachel, as you say, in putting together these very different modes and tonal qualities of history and the present, including charging Hollywood cinema and the studio system with homophobic censorship that had pervaded American life and continue to, and in a way arguing that the Hays Code and Hollywood censorship was complicit in the AIDS epidemic, because it had created shame around what it called sex deviance. It couldn't even refer to homosexuality in the code, it just referred to sex deviance, and that persisted even in the American independent cinema of the 1970s to a certain extent. So there wasn't really a cinematic history or a televisual history that people could find themselves reflecting, could find these images of pleasure. And so what Nitrate Kisses is doing with those images, and with the fact they were consensually produced and that they were filmed by a exquisitely gifted filmmaker who'd also filmed herself having sex, and that was part of what she could say to the participants, been there, done that, screened it all over the world, that pleasure is something that I think in colonial capitalist culture is seen as frivolous. It's a frippery, it's ornamental, it's an add-on, or it has to be totally tied to some sort of capitalistic gain, particularly like a gain of power or an economic gain. And the film is the complete opposite of that. Its pleasure and joy take their place alongside, as you say, dusty archival ephemera, alongside film of shadow on the street, alongside voices speaking about both, great pain and great joy. I'm thinking particularly the voices in the early section of the older dykes speaking about, their lives in the 40s and 50s and how they understood their gender and their sexuality and what they were and how they looked at women. And, you know, I think of the one of the directors who says, you know, we always used to play ambulance, and I would always make sure that I was the one carrying the girl to the ambulance. You know, those moments which are called oral history or personal or ephemera, or they're such, you know, as you say, important observations of the body, of the body's history, of the pleasure that there is in that history. I think, you know, it sets this new framework for documentary. And yeah, it's hard to sort of characterize it without just describing scene by scene. You know, I really love this bit, but I think it's really against the idea that pleasure is some sort of excess. You know, even though it talks about the transgressive, you know, it has that quote from, you know, obviously Michel Foucault, where it's like, we need a radical transgression. The sex scenes are not framed as transgressive. They are, which is not to say, oh, you know, they're just like tender vanilla kissing. There's BDSM sex, but it's not presented in this way that is exoticized or fetishized, or disruptive, even though it does interrupt, or we could say come between, you know, parts of the interview and parts of the other archive footage, and Hammer's own footage of her travels in Europe. It's not an excess, it's totally part of lived experience and totally part of filmed experience. And I think that still, you know, remains something that audiovisual culture is striving for, and our culture as a whole is striving for.
Yeah, I think it's how you're saying, it's really hard to talk about it without describing it, or just thinking also of you know, didactics. It's tactical, it's touching, you know, everything. Yeah, that's exactly what I want to just be like, you know.
I know, this is the, you know, I've done a few events during lockdown, including a launch for the book with Peninsula, and I've kept, you know, really in my heart the desire to be in a room with people, and this is the event where I have felt that the most uncontrollably, the desire to have been with all of you before this event, leading into it, and now, and the idea that our discussions would continue after this formal bit, because I just feel like, particularly with Barbara's films, because they're so tactile, because they touch you, because they're so palpable, and also because they're so open, because she pursues so many ideas at once, watching her films often leads people to say, oh, I want to write this, or I want to look at this in the archives, or I wonder what would happen if I made a film that was like this. Like, they're so generous and generative, and and they're so generous and generative between our bodies. You know, she made an amazing film called Audience, where for several years she documented audiences watching her own films, which sounds like the most arrogant thing to do, like such a, you know, self-reflexive, boorish thing. But it was in the 1980s when there was this particular turn in, like, in Anglo feminism and white middle class feminism against sex, and Hammer found that her films started to be excluded from film festivals because they depicted naked bodies, they depicted sexuality, they depicted lesbian sex, because she depicted BDSM sex. You know, there are stories of people ripping, in the later 80s and in the early 90s, ripping VHSs out of machines. So she started documenting these challenging and hostile audiences, which had often grown out of feminist encounter groups. And it's just that extraordinary sense of the fact that film is something that happens among bodies, and even when we're all in our own rooms, it's still happening between our bodies. Like, the digital obviously tries to abstract that and deny it, but all our bodies are still here tonight in everything that they are, connected by that film. But yeah, I do wish, like, that we could be together, excited about those moments.
100%.
You know, I don't want to discount that outcome of, like, festival events and, you know, being in the bar. Jenny Olsen talks about this really beautifully, that part of getting involved, particularly in queer film programming, was it was a way to date and pick people up, like, you know. that's a really important context for Hammer making and exhibiting her work.
Definitely watching Nitrate Kisses for the first time and it being on my screen alone at home was it's bittersweet because it's an amazing film, but it was also like, how watching this with a group, with an audience, it's funny and it's alive, and I can just imagine, and it's sexy and it's a bit awkward in times, so I can just imagine it being a really intense and amazing experience, and I can't wait to watch it properly, hopefully off that print sometime. That would be really nice. But speaking of bodies and people connecting, we have got a couple of questions in the chat, and I would love to just bring those in. So there was one question that we had from Kat, and Kat says, I know So spoke a lot about the physical bodies and voices portrayed in Nitrate Kisses, but I was wondering what they thought about the camera itself and the exhibition of the film in the way it preserves such an important part of queer history. And then as an example, Kat puts in Derek Jarman's Blue, a film devoid of the physical body. There's so much to consider in the physical filmmaking process, as well as contemporary screenings in the way we can understand queer death, memory, and history. Blue is such a great example, actually.
It's an incredible example, not least because in its original exhibition, Blue was not a film with a soundtrack. It was just the image track, and the voices were performed live. Simon Fish Turner writes about this really incredibly. The composer who composed the soundtrack and composed for many of Jarman's films, and it would be a sort of ramshackle collection of different performers from the large repertoire company of friends and lovers, and professionals who circulated around Jarman, as well as Jarman himself, doing a kind of film telling. And it was from those performances that the soundtrack of the film was condensed. And when Jarman died, the film wasn't finished. And I mentioned this in the book briefly. They hadn't aligned the soundtrack with the image track. So the image track was played on Channel 4 and the soundtrack was played on the radio. And you turn them on and participate in them together. So a lot of the experimental filmmaking from the 60s through the 80s, I guess up to the point of the digital, was a lot of thinking about this situation of exhibition and thinking about the materiality of film itself. And, you know, absolutely the issue of, you know, it mattered who was behind the camera, what the camera was, and then how the film was screened and presented. And that started to return. I mean, I think this year it's been talked about a huge amount, but it had started to return in terms of streaming services and digitality, and the, you know, both the pros and cons of digital streaming in terms of access and, you know, making huge amounts of material available and subtitled and contextualized and you know, accessible in all sorts of different ways. And then the way in which a lot of experimental work was made, which was within communities, and not just experimental work, a lot of like verite documentary in the 70s as well was made within communities to be shown first to those communities, and how that's been altered. So when Hammer was first screening her films, she was mainly screening them to like feminist groups and lesbian groups. And then, you know, at queer festivals, and then a festival like Sundance, there's a change of context, not least because, let's remember, it's in Utah, which is a Mormon state. And it was only 2 years after the famous first ever panel at Sundance on queer cinema, chaired by B. Rich, where she coined the term New Queer Cinema. So now we think of Sundance having this long history of association with quilt bag cinema, but it was only 2 years old at that time. And so for Hammer to submit her film to Sundance showed a huge amount of trust in that festival and those audiences. So exhibition, the camera, you see Hammer's camera on film in the film, and I'm going to show that clip at the end. You know, she used a Bolex and then a 16mm camera. She did make some video works in the 80s, and then in later years did move to digital. She was always extremely conscious of the camera she was using. There's a film that she made with, I think it's a 90mm camera, where the frame is, and that aperture is so wide that the whole image is shaking the whole time because she mounted it on her body. and she drove across America with this camera. So this is, again, this is like the perfect question for Hammer as a practitioner. I'm not a filmmaker, and she would go into depth for an hour with you about different kinds of cameras and what they produce. She also did installations and performances where she carried around a huge inflated ball that had this film, whose name I'm forgetting, I think it's called Light Moves, projected on it. So she would carry around the film on this spherical ball, which then further distorted what had already been distorted by the lens. Her body was always part of how she thought about exhibition. And, her final two works were both performance lectures in which her body was present up to the point that she couldn't perform them anymore, and then they were documented and shared online. So your question is making me wonder whether Hammer and Jarman ever had a conversation, because this is also something I'm interested in the book brings up, is these kind of interconnections and chance meetings. Did they meet at Sundance in 91, for example? Because I think this would have really been one of the things they talked about, like how your films change in different situations of exhibition. Jarman writes, really brilliantly about this in his diaries, and his constant like suspicion of institutional screenings and festival screenings, and the British Council sending him to Russia, Soviet Russia, to screen his films. I think this is a really undocumented history in lots of ways. This is one reason I work on curational history, and this is something Club des Femmes do quite a lot, and I know that Rachel and Camilla look at as well, which is the history of how films are actually seen. Who saw them, where, how, where were their filmmakers there, what did they think of them? And it's really unrecorded because it is a bodily history. Cinema likes to partake of this abstracted Euro-Western idea that it just transmits from mind to mind, and also that a film is a film is a film. It's unchanged by circumstances of viewing. And that can be true of like mass media films in some senses, because there are so many people access them on such a huge scale in so many ways, and often repeatedly. But with a film like Nitrate Kisses, there is actually a traceable history of viewing that is quite specific, and that has shaped how the film comes to have meaning. So that's a really brilliant question, and I'm gonna stop answering it now.
Yeah, it definitely has. Just you telling us tonight that you first watched it with your headphones on, which is probably how a lot of us actually watched it.
Absolutely.
Again. But yeah, we also have a question more about the actual archive now in this time moving into the digital realm, by Robert, who says that I really liked how the visual image of a physical archive portrayed by So showed how powerful such an archive can be. I'm wondering now what they think the implications are, these archives moving into the digital realm. I mean, in the sense of Nitrate Kisses, for example, moving into the digital realm made it possible for all of us to watch it.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
I mean, as someone who's worked on the digitization of a physical archive, I would sort of point out that an archive doesn't move into a digital realm. All of the physical materials still remain. They need to be cared for. They need to be available. If they belong to an artist who is still alive and working, they also need to be accessible to that artist, who may be reinterpreting them or moving them around. So while availability has moved into the digital realm, to some extent, archives remain in a physical realm. I have very multiple mixed feelings, and I'm sure that you do as well, possibly Rachel and Camilla, as people who work on archives, and particularly because you're working remotely from each other in different cities from each other. I think, as we've all experienced over the last year, digitization and remote working can provide forms of access that particularly disabled people have been advocating for a very long time. and advocating for it to be seen not as some sort of second-class access, but watching a film on your laptop. It's the same as watching it on a cinema if that's what is possible or most possible for you. It has to be affordable. The digital divide still means that digitality doesn't mean that everything is accessible to everyone. And there's also a kind of cloaking whereby digital I guess, sort of proliferation hides the extent of what's missing from the archives, because we're so super saturated by availability. Like the number of films we could all have watched this year, including, you know, films by filmmakers like Sarah Maldoror, whose work that I've wanted to see for decades. The overwhelming presence of digital material may distract us from looking at who's providing that material, how is it being provided, where are the jagged edges, who's not accessing it, who's not visible in it, what is being omitted, what isn't being digitized, what is digitized but not available, or only available through if you have an academic login, or you're willing to pay for it. So, you know, a lot of really great conversations this year about academic publishing and the ridiculous like cost of it that is so exclusionary. So, you know, like with any new technology, like with the emergence of film cameras themselves, there are very utopian arguments for availability and access. And then there's also, I think, a need to have an awareness of what's being left out and also what's being taken. Not everything that is digitized with consent. You know, some of the things that are available, and this, you know, there's a big debate about the internet library early in lockdown. Not everything that is available digitally is there because it's, you know, sticking it to the man. In some cases, there are things that have been downloaded or taken from artists' own sites where that work is their source of income. They're radical, you know, experimental artists. So I don't think there's like a blanket argument, but there's both the impact and possibility and power of them, and a lot more people have been introduced to archival work and to watching archival film because it's freely available. And I think we also need a kind of literacy, a digital literacy around it. And to make sure that this doesn't mean that archives close in on themselves and go, well, you know, you can find everything online. Why would you, not a senior academic, need access to what we have in our museum or collection? You're not allowed to interrogate it because we've put 4% of it online, of the, you know, the stuff that is most monumentalizing and most sanitized. Yeah, and that also comes down to funding, what there's funding to digitize. So glass half, yeah, half full.
Mm-hmm. Completely share your ambivalence about that, because obviously we're two people who came to film curating very much needing digital films to be there and needing that resource, because we didn't come with knowledge of how to reel a projector, and we haven't shown things from prints generally. And for us, digitization has been what's enabled us to show things. But also something that I think is really important is that there's a really big risk that the illusion of access means people, as you say, don't interrogate what actually is accessible. And there's some huge, massive films made by women that you cannot legally watch in the UK in any digital form. Like really big films, Kathleen Collins' Losing Ground, Claudia Vile's Girlfriend, in the UK, those are not digitally available to rent in any legal way. You can find dodgy versions on YouTube, or you can import a DVD from America, or you can use a geo-blocker. But these are like massive classics that you can't access. And when you think about that, then you realize there must be so much stuff that we're not aware that we can't access. And the kind of illusion of quantity is a really big problem. And it kind of eats into your critical ability to work out what actually you can watch, if you see what I mean. I think it's just really important to keep that skepticism about what is available and make sure that we're continually interrogating that digitally, especially if we're continuing to access things remotely more and more.
And I just saw that Brian Beattie, who I think has left the event, but if you're still here, thank you for this point, Brian, that quite near the beginning of the shelter in place order in New York, Electronic Arts Intermix did make a program of Barbara Hammer's work available online through a New York gallery. It was one of the first online screenings that I was actually aware of, and they made a program of her digitized, like quite rare short films available for about 2 weeks. And Brian comments that, you know, that this made it possible for him to discover her work. And yeah, so her commitment in the latter years of her life, when her cancer had recurred, to archiving her own work, to working with an archivist who was writing a book about it, to working with younger filmmakers, to working with Academy Film Archives, to working with Electronic Arts Intermix, to make her work available, to have it digitized, partially because of these big retrospectives at Tate and MoMA. Not every artist gets that opportunity to do that and to be, you know, to some extent supported. I mean, it wasn't like private companies or Martin Scorsese were throwing millions of dollars at her, but there was some money within the experimental filmmaking community in recognition of her stature as an artist and the range of her work and what it had to offer. And not every artist who has that opportunity takes care of their archives, either because they assume that they will be taken care of by others, or because they're just scrambling to make work, you know, minute by minute. So there's such a complex set of factors that goes into, you know, for example, a film that we showed in 2017 with Club des Femmes, a Cuban film called De Cierta Manera by Sara Gomez. The filmmaker died before she completed the final edits on the film, and it has an orphan status in terms of who has the authority over the final cut of that film. And it's also been affected in terms of global north circulation by the US embargo on Cuba. So there is one print, it's in Berlin, and you know, really pressing ethical questions remain around that film because the filmmaker didn't complete it. One of her colleagues completed it, Thomas Alea Gutierrez, who's a very, you know, established, well-known filmmaker in his own right and was her teacher and collaborator. But this also opens the question of like, how much should be available to us? Like there's a Euro-Western assumption that everything should be available and should be knowable and should be usable and appropriable. And there are also, you know, different kinds of cultural contexts, as we were saying about, like, you know, screening context. Should every film be available for every screening context? Should every piece of archival material be available to everyone? Because people do tend to appropriate, decontextualize and profit from them in a world of saturated over availability. And so those ethical questions around the use of archival material, which I think Nitrate Kisses considers so beautifully, even as it's, you know, reinterpreting the Willa Cather archive, it contextualizes how it has the right and responsibility to do that by showing that actually it's Cather's archive that has been decontextualized by the people who are keeping it and are saying, oh no, shit, they were just friends. They were just friends who lived together for their whole lives and like to dress up with moustaches on and go horse riding. No, it doesn't mean anything. It's just the prairies. You know, it sets out its case so carefully leading up to that wonderful protest footage for what it's doing and why it has the right to it. So it's also the argument, the cinerhetoric of the film, that you know, it's not just grabbing archival material, it's making an argument with it. So and that's why organizations like Electronic Arts Intermix or festivals like Document, organizations like Lux Scotland are so important because they offer contexts for screening, context for watching. They take care of the works, both like in physical terms and in terms of their presentation and exhibition. So
well, we are aware of the time, and we are aware that it's Friday evening. We do want to read out another question from Lewis, and that is, you spoke about our addiction to linear narrative at one point. I'm interested to hear more about that idea, the relationship between queerness and non-linearity, and if perhaps you see linearity in storytelling as particularly heteronormative.
Yes. I think Jack Halberstam talks about this really brilliantly, that kind of the linearity of sort of Euro-Western storytelling is predicated on a kind of heteronormative life way or life shape. And what the points of that story are, which are also very gendered and separated by gender and conformed by gender, lend themselves or shape this kind of conformity to linearity. And in the book, I talk about a particular sort of counter idea, which is the idea of folded time. And I'm just going to check the name of the Julian Carter, who's a trans theorist and scholar, talks about folds of time, of the way in which transition, a realizing transition, can revivify, reshape personal and political and cultural memories. And that doesn't change them or alter them. It brings out what was already there by folding back what we see as the present into the past, or the future into the present. But it kind of questions that temporal relationship. And it partially has to, because of the linear narrative of heteronormativity and the heteronormative narrative of linearity that precludes very much, particularly in UK culture, the idea that as a 2-year-old, you know your gender or you know your sexuality if they're not cis heteronormative. So those narratives are demanded to be folded back. So yes, I do think that linearity is heteronormative. I think Ursula K. Le Guin's A Carry Bag of Fiction makes this case with great wit and humour and many puns about arrows and spears. She's very self-aware, normatively gendered. And so I recommend that essay as some of the basis for my thinking. And then, Jack Halberstam's writing on time as well. I think there was maybe one more question that I can try and squeeze.
Yes, there was one, which actually might be a good one to wrap up on, because it kind of opens out to other films quite nicely. So Shay asks, I was wondering if Someone Invisible could talk on the creation of archive. Watching Nitrate, I couldn't help but think of NEA-funded The Watermelon Woman, amazing film, and Julie Hartman's work that So talks about in their book. Just asking what parallels and differences they see in these works and their creations.
Thanks, Shay. And so those of you who've watched Nitrate Kisses and are wondering what that voiceover at the end is, it's reading out a letter that challenged the NEA funding for what the artists known as the NEA4, who are queer and feminist artists of the Reagan era, including Karen Finley, whose funding was challenged in Congress. And this happened again with The Watermelon Woman, after a film critic referred to it having the hottest sex scene that she'd ever seen. A Republican senator got wind of the fact that it had literally less than 1/10 of its budget as NEA funding, and tried to make a case, this was under I guess Bush 1, that funding should be taken back. And so The Watermelon Woman also became this kind of spectacle on the floor of the House of Representatives. And actually that debate led to the end of NEA funding for individual artists. And I should say that the rest of the budget for The Watermelon Woman was raised by the 1990s equivalent of crowdfunding, which was having a potluck. So, if you don't want to crowdfund for your next project, do consider the potluck method. I think, there are strong interrelations between Cheryl Dunier's work. Cheryl Dunier, who made The Watermelon Woman, and Nitrate Kisses. And I think in particular, one of the things that is one of the connections is that Nitrate Kisses is also about Black queer history. It's about the erased history of the blues, and it includes the song BD Women and Sissy Man blues, and specifically talks about the erasure of Black queerness by the mainstream. And this is something that is picked up on from the 30s through to the 60s in Watermelon Woman, but by a Black filmmaker. And Hannah was white, and Cheryl Dunier and Saidiya Hartman are approaching their history of Black culture from the inside for their archive, and looking at those intersections of blackness and queerness with a specificity, you know, whereas Hammer's work is interested also in people like Willa Cather and Gertrude Stein, who, you know, were racists. And that is a really important distinction, that Hammer's work is generous and, you know, cumulative, but that some of the figures that she was looking at who are important in lesbian history are also, you know, white and are problematic. And whereas Saidiya Hartman's work, obviously coming later, coming after the work done in the 90s, and I think, you know, the book that Shay's referring to is Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, is looking specifically at where blackness and queerness touch differently than where whiteness and queerness touch, and where white culture and white people sometimes excluded black people from there and continue to do from their different definitions of queerness or quilt bag, didn't recognize black sexualities that might not fit that description, or use them as ways to control and constrain black people, to punish black people. So there's an important intersectional aspect of critique in Cheryl Dunier and Saidiya Hartman's work that builds on what Hammer was doing. And I think that, I hope that that kind of complexity and complexification and relation and also contestation around whose archives, who has the right to open these archives, continues in that granular way, because that just, you know, produces work that has that specificity of livingness, that does that work of palliative care, and care for audiences as well. So, yeah.
I think that's a really beautiful note to kind of wrap up on. Just before we wrap up, I just wanted to acknowledge that Oysten has put in the comments a comment about the situation in Brazil, which I think is really important as people who love archives to talk about just really quickly. I know, Camilla, you know more about this than I do, but the situation in Brazil is really alarming. Do you want to just really quickly let people know what that is?
Yeah, so basically, so I'm half Brazilian, so that's a very emotional that our president is had complete disregard to humanity, really, but also culture, and has basically defunded most of the arts, and the Cinemateca Brasileira, basically the biggest film archive we have in the country, is closed. The staff hasn't been paid. There is absolutely no taking care, exactly what we were talking about this whole time. There's no care being taken of this archive whatsoever right now. And yeah, so basically it's a very dire situation. And that was, I'm just reading your comment now, Shin. Yeah, the building to go up and fight.
Oh, so I think you're just on mute.
For people who might want to sort of get some more context than we can do in a few minutes, the new issue of Film Quarterly has a very timely focus on Brazilian cinema. The editor, BBB Rich, has been working with Latin American cinema for many, many decades, and it's an opportunity to read interviews with filmmakers and critics and hear about the situation with the archives and funding. And I think we need to do more of this transnational work and more of these transnational connections, you know, exactly the kind that Barbara Hammer was such a champion of as well, and to do them respectfully. And so, yeah, the book ends with speaking about a Brazilian film whose filmmakers were almost prevented from traveling by Bolsonaro's funding cuts. And, you know, I wish the book could have been longer and looked at more transnational situations, could have looked at the situation for quilt bag cinema in India, could have looked at the situation, you know, now in Poland and Hungary. And I hope you will all go and write those books. or write those articles or read about them or tweet about them or share about them, you know, we can all in different ways be connecting and learning and participating. You know, that moment with headphones on 20 years ago led me in some weird way to be here, and that's how it started, was just an encounter with a film that was like being, you know, electrified. So, you know, if that's been what's happened for you or happened with films at this festival, start, you know, converse with them and share about them. And that's the most exciting, I think, outcome, is that the archive, you know, we don't let the archive be this fixed thing controlled by the state. The archive is our bodies, it's what we make it. You know, with all the caveats about that being within, you know, digital platforms controlled by multi-billionaires who are evil, you know, we have ways of touching each other. And it's really touched me that so many people have joined us this evening. And thank you particularly to Rachel and Camilla for wonderful questions and sharing, and to everyone who asked a question and everyone who listened. So thank you hugely.
Thank you, everybody.
Oh, shall I show the final?
Do you want to play a clip? Yeah.
Do people want to see a final clip from Nitrate Kisses? People who can say yes. Okay. I got so overexcited, I'd forgotten. We've got another clip. All right. It's a juicy one, I promise.
At the heart of the archives is a vision of intergenerational connection, which means dykes from the 90s understand butches from the 60s, and they understand bull daggers from the 30s, at least through the cultural artifacts that have been left. We're an international archives, and that's really important to us. Send us something in the language you make love in, and we have wonderful lesbian materials, books and articles and periodicals, and I think close to 15 different languages. And just yesterday, a woman from Yugoslavia came with the first anything published lesbian that's ever appeared in Yugoslavia. And oftentimes women come here on pilgrimages. The Italian women brought the first lesbian book by Italian lesbians. There are newspapers from, again, in print and out of print, from all over the country.
Just as a final fact, that voiceover was by one of the people who worked at the Lesbian Herstory Archives in New York, which is the organization lovingly satirized in The Watermelon Woman as the Center for Lesbian Information and Technology, or CLIT. And I can't think of a word that Barbara Hammer would more want us to end this event with.